You know, usually when we talk about like a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of absolute precision.
Well, yeah.
Like you break your arm, the x-ray shows a jagged white line fracturing the bone, and the doctor just points to the screen and says, there it is.
It's broken or it's not.
Exactly. It's clean. It's an observable fact. But if we take that exact same diagnostic mindset and we put causality itself under the x-ray.
Oh, boy. Right.
Or if we try to find the exact microscopic millimeter where a cause dies and an effect is born, the machine completely breaks down. We're looking at a landscape that is just entirely murky.
Yeah, we're trying to find a solid line in a totally fluid reality.
Yeah.
And, you and our listeners have already navigated the foundational arguments of Nāgārjuna's text, the MMK.
Right.
We've established the groundwork in previous deep dives, like exploring how Chapter 1 dismantled the broad concept of a cause. So today, we're taking a magnifying glass to the actual junction itself.
The actual bridge. Exactly. We're diving into Chapter 21, which is Origination and Disappearance, or Sambhava and Vibhava. And we're deploying an 11-step diagnostic framework, the Madhyamaka General Reasoning, to interrogate this literal mathematical bridge where one moment ends and another begins.
And to do that, we have a massive source stack today. We're triangulating the Sanskrit nuances using 4 heavyweight scholarly translations of Chapter 21.
Which is so necessary for this text.
Oh, absolutely. So we've got the Padmakar Translation Group, J. Garfield, Stephen Babsler, and Frederick Strang. Plus, we had these extensive web notes outlining the architecture of the text. So the mission is singular, but it's monumental. We are executing a highly specific diagnostic analysis on that junction of causality.
And we really need to set the stakes here because they cannot be overstated.
Yeah.
If this microscopic bridge, this transition moment between a cause ceasing and an effect beginning, if that collapses under logical scrutiny, it doesn't just rewrite our everyday physics.
It takes down everything. Right. It completely refutes the ancient Abhidharma theory of a chain of successive moments of consciousness. It dismantles the karmic cycle of rebirths.
Right.
It shatters the 12 links of dependent origination. It even, threatens to erase the strict boundary between samsara, the cycle of suffering, and nirvana, ultimate liberation.
Because if the bridge isn't inherently real, nothing can absolutely cross it.
Exactly. Not a physical object, not a moment of mind, and not a soul moving from one life to the next.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if you thought dismantling the basic idea of a cause was intense in Chapter 1, wait until we try to find the literal bridge between a cause and an effect. So let's move directly into step 1 of our analysis.
Identifying the triad at the junction.
Right. To even begin applying Madhyamaka reasoning, we first have to recognize how the dualistic human mind naturally constructs reality, right? We don't experience the universe as this fluid, unbroken whole.
We can't. It's a cognitive survival mechanism.
Exactly. We slice reality into manageable pieces. So specifically at this junction of causality, our minds identify a triad. 3 distinct spheres.
Let's lay those out.
So first, there's origination, which is the coming into being of the effect. Second, there's the relation or opposition, the actual transition point. And third, disappearance, the going into non-existence of the cause.
Coming, going, and the gap between them.
Exactly.
And to truly grasp why slicing reality this way creates such a profound vulnerability, we have to look at the intellectual environment Nāgārjuna was in. He was directly challenging the Abhidharma scholars.
The ultimate taxonomists of reality.
Right. These ancient Buddhist philosophers believed that to cure human suffering, you had to break reality down to its absolute, irreducible building blocks. They called these dharmas.
Right.
And they posited that these dharmas were discrete, inherently existing moments. So their theory of time was like a cosmic stop-motion film.
I love that analogy.
It's super helpful. You have a frame of existence, moment A. But for the film to move forward, moment A must completely, entirely cease to exist, plunge into non-existence, so that the next frame, moment B, can emerge.
They called this the immediately preceding condition, right? The strict, linear sequence of the universe.
Yes.
But Nāgārjuna basically forces us to look at the dark space between the frames of the film. Like, if moment A has to completely die for moment B to be born, what exactly is happening at the borderline between them?
Which is where our sources introduce another really helpful analogy.
This river.
Right. We usually view existence as this vast flowing river, an endless karmic cycle, and it feels predictable. But when we apply conceptual analysis, we take scissors to the river.
We snip it.
We snip it into those triads. We isolate the old moment dying, the transition, and the new moment being born. We draw these hard black lines on the water.
And by drawing those lines, by claiming that those snipped pieces of the river have absolute independent existence, the Abhidharma scholars created a massive paradox.
A fatal flaw.
Yeah, and this brings in a crucial seed of argument from all the way back in chapter 1, verse 1.9. Our sources actually explicitly reference this as the logical foundation for chapter 21.
Right, because that verse poses a really devastating question. If the cause has completely ceased to exist, it is nothing. It is a non-entity.
Yeah.
So how can absolute nothingness function as an immediately preceding condition that pushes an effect into existence?
Okay, I want to push back on this on behalf of, our shared everyday experience.
Ready for it.
Because on the surface, this sounds a bit like a semantic trick. If I'm holding a glass and I open my hand, the glass drops and shatters on the floor.
Right.
My action of opening my hand is entirely in the past by the time the glass hits the floor. The action is gone. It disappeared. Are we really saying the past, just because it has disappeared, has zero power to shatter the glass in the present?
Well, you are illustrating the exact cognitive dissonance Nāgārjuna wants us to confront. You are assuming your past action exerts a persistent force that somehow travels across a span of time to enact a result.
Right, like an invisible wave or something.
Exactly. But let's apply the Abhidharma logic strictly. If that past action is truly, absolutely gone, if its disappearance is a complete inherent fact, finished and sealed, then there is a literal gap of absolute nothingness between the release of the glass and the shattering.
Oh, I see.
Right. Causal force cannot travel through an ontological void. If the cause is dead, it has no hands to push the effect.
Wow. Okay, so this structural flaw basically forces us to bring in the heavy machinery of our diagnostic framework.
Yes, step 2. Deploying the tetralemma on the junction itself.
The tetralemma, the ultimate logic trap in Madhyamaka philosophy.
The four-cornered negation.
Right. We systematically apply this to the junction to just exhaust every possible logical explanation. We ask, are going, the disappearance of the cause, and coming, the origination of the effect, different and entirely separate in time?
That's one.
Or are they identical and overlapping for a period of time? Are they somehow both? Or are they neither? And since basic logic dictates there is no fifth option, if inherent causality genuinely exists, it absolutely must fit into one of these four boxes.
So let's examine the verses where Nāgārjuna tests these boxes. Let's start with the horn of the tetralemma that asks if disappearance and origination are identical or if they overlap.
Because if they overlap, we supposedly solve that void problem, right?
Exactly. So we analyze verses 3 and 5 for this. In Strang's translation of verse 3, Nāgārjuna asks, how can disappearance exist concomitantly with origination? Since surely death does not exist at the same moment as birth.
Yeah.
And Garfield translates verse 5 with this similar razor-sharp focus. He says, how could destruction and becoming occur simultaneously, just as birth and death do not occur simultaneously?
I mean, if I try to cognitively simulate that, the absurdity is pretty clear. If my hand opening and the glass shattering happen at the identical microsecond, causality is destroyed.
It's just two things happening.
Right. Causality inherently requires an arrow of time. One thing must lead to another. So if they perfectly overlap, one isn't causing the other, they're just sitting side by side in time as independent events.
Exactly.
If disappearance and origination happen at the exact same time, a thing is dying and being born in the exact same instant, which totally violates the definition of change. Change demands sequence.
Synchronicity is not causality.
Yeah.
So, boom, the identical or overlapping box of the tetralemma collapses entirely.
Right. So the opponent, realizing the overlap destroys sequence, has to retreat to the other primary horn.
That they are different, completely separate in time.
Moment A finishes, the door closes, and then moment B starts.
Which brings us to verses 2 and 4. Let's look at verse 2 in Stephen Batchelor's translation. How can passing exist without rising? Is there death without birth? There is no passing without rising.
So if origination and disappearance are inherently fundamentally separate entities, like they have their own absolute independent existence, then they are hermetically sealed off from each other.
Yes, and if they are truly sealed off, logic dictates you could theoretically encounter one without the other.
Oh, right.
You could have a disappearance that isn't connected to an origination, a death without a prior birth. The concept becomes complete nonsense.
And verse 4 drives that nail in. How could rising exist without passing? Things are never not impermanent.
Impermanence is never absent from entities. If origination was an inherently separate, isolated thing, it would be permanently locked in a static state of originating.
It would never pass away.
Exactly. If origination and disappearance are inherently separate, they can never touch, they can never interact, and they become these frozen, absolute monoliths.
So the conclusion drawn from verses 1 through 6 is just profound. Since origination and disappearance cannot be logically established as occurring at the same time because that destroys the necessary sequence of change,
Right.
nor at different times because that destroys their necessary connection. They cannot be inherently established at all.
The very concepts of coming and going just fall apart under the microscope.
But Nāgārjuna doesn't stop at abstract concepts, does he?
No, he takes this broken junction and applies it directly to the objects themselves, the actual phenomena that are supposedly coming and going.
Right, in verses 7 through 10.
Yeah, he categorizes reality into destructible things and indestructible things. And he asks if origination and disappearance can logically apply to either category.
Okay, let's break that down.
So, if a thing is destructible, meaning its fundamental nature is impermanent, then it cannot possess an inherent absolute origination.
Why?
Because if its core nature is to be destroyed, it was never a stable, inherently existing thing to begin with. Its very destructibility contradicts the idea that it has a solid, independent birth.
And if we look at the inverse, if a thing is indestructible, meaning it is permanent and absolute, then origination and disappearance obviously can't apply to it at all.
Right. A permanent thing cannot be born, because it always was, and it cannot die because it is permanent. It precludes change entirely.
And in verse 9, he extends this to the concept of emptiness itself, right?
He does. He states that origination and disappearance do not obtain for that which is empty, nor for that which is non-empty.
So verse 10 basically summarizes the tetralemma's destruction of the junction. It is fundamentally inadmissible that origination and disappearance are the exact same thing, and it is equally inadmissible that they are completely different.
They fail on all fronts.
I have to pause here, because this is the exact point in the analysis where an empirical observer's brain starts waving a massive red flag.
I know exactly what you're going to say.
I mean, I can track the logic puzzle,
What?
but I look around the room right now and I literally see things originating and disappearing every single second.
Right.
I watch the steam rise from my coffee cup and disappear into the air. I see the seasons change outside my window. Leaves originate in the spring and they disappear in the fall.
Yeah.
So how can Nāgārjuna use a rigid logical structure to deny the lived empirical experience of the universe that is happening right in front of my eyes?
That empirical pushback is the most vital objection to raise. And Nāgārjuna actually anticipates it directly in verse 11. He addresses the observer.
What does he say?
In the Madhyamaka translation, he writes, I see arising and destruction. If such a thought occurs to you, only through confusion are arising and destruction seen.
Only through confusion. Wow. That is not just a philosophical pivot. That is a direct accusation about the basic functioning of human perception.
He is pointing out the critical difference between conventional appearance and ultimate reality. Empirical observation does not prove inherent existence.
Right.
Just because you visually or physically perceive a phenomenon does not mean you are perceiving reality as it absolutely is. Consider the analogy of a magic trick.
Okay.
You empirically observe a woman being sawed in half on a stage. Your eyes relay that data to your brain. But your empirical observation merely proves that you are experiencing a diluted conventional perception.
Because you're perceiving an illusion crafted by specific conditions.
Exactly. Nāgārjuna is arguing that our everyday perception of a solid cause creating a solid effect is the exact same kind of cognitive illusion.
It's an evolutionary heuristic.
Yes, born from our mind's desperate need to categorize reality, to find solid ground where there is literally only flux.
Man. Here's where it gets really interesting, because if the basic physics of dropping a glass or watching steam rise are cognitive illusions, the implications scale up astronomically.
They absolutely do.
Which means we have to transition into section 3, breaking the chain of existence. We are taking this broken junction of causality and applying it to the grandest systemic model of all.
The karmic cycle itself.
Right. This is where the metaphysical stakes we established at the beginning come to a head.
And in verse 15, Nāgārjuna voices the opponent's strongest, most desperate counterargument.
The opponent is trying to save the framework, right? The 12 links of dependent origination, the wheel of life.
Yeah, the opponent essentially argues, okay, maybe isolating individual causes and effects under a microscope creates paradoxes.
Yeah.
But existence isn't a series of isolated dots. It's a continuity.
The Padmakara translation captures this perfectly. One might claim that things exist, that there is neither permanence nor yet annihilation. For existence is a continuity of causes and effects that rise and then subside.
The opponent is pointing back to the flowing river. They're saying, stop looking at the individual droplets of water, look at the continuity of the stream. The stream is undeniably real.
It's a brilliant systemic defense.
It is, because it attempts to bypass the microscopic tetralemma by shifting focus to the macroscopic process. But Nāgārjuna's rebuttal across verses 16 through 21 systematically dismantles this idea of an inherently existing continuity.
So in verse 16, he basically uses their own premise against them.
He says, let's assume the karmic cycle is indeed a continuous chain of causes and effects rising and being destroyed. However, the Abhidharma scholars already established that for a sequence to occur, the previous cause must be fully destroyed. The previous moment must end.
Right.
But if a cause is fully, absolutely destroyed, if it has ceased into non-existence, it is completely gone. It cannot originate again.
Therefore, the connection is severed at every single link.
Yes. A chain made of links that completely blink out of existence into an absolute void is not a continuous chain at all.
The continuity is fundamentally broken by their own definition of discrete moments.
The opponent is trapped by their own desire for absolute definitions. They want the moments of time to be discrete and independent so they can be categorized, but they simultaneously want an unbreakable thread of continuity connecting them to preserve karma.
And Nāgārjuna demonstrates you cannot have both. If the links are absolute and discrete, the thread snaps.
Exactly. And this creates a catastrophic problem for the concept of rebirth, which is central to the worldview he's deconstructing. We see this play out in verse 20.
Right. Let's look at Frederick Streng's translation of verse 20. It focuses on the skandhas, the aggregates. Can someone be produced in those groups of universal elements, skandhas, in which he is also dying?
To understand the weight of this, we have to unpack what a skandha is.
Right, the aggregates. Form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. They bundle together to create the illusion of a self.
Exactly. When a person dies, that specific bundle of aggregates dissolves. When rebirth occurs, a new bundle forms. So the profound question here is about identity and karmic transfer across that gap.
The bridge between lives.
Yes. If the aggregates of the dying person are completely inherently separate from the newborn person, which they must be if they are discrete, absolute moments in time separated by death, then there is no bridge.
Karma cannot transfer across a void of absolute difference.
Right. The actions of the past person have no logical mechanism to attach to the future person. They are entirely disconnected strangers.
But on the other horn of the dilemma, if the aggregates of the dying person and the newborn person are fundamentally the exact same inherent thing, if they're identical to preserve the karmic continuity, then no actual death and rebirth occurred at all.
Exactly. It's just a static, unchanging, immortal entity wearing different masks.
Either you have two disconnected strangers and karma is meaningless, or you have one immortal being and rebirth is meaningless. The bridge of rebirth is an illusion.
This systemic breakdown culminates in a total temporal collapse in verse 21. The very sequence of time required for a cycle of existence cannot be logically sustained.
The translations of this final verse are really chilling in their finality. Garfield translates it, since the series of cyclic existence is not evident in the three times, if it is not in the three times, how could there be a series of cyclic existence?
Batchelor translates it. Likewise, if the continuity of becoming is not reasonable at any of the three times, how can there be a continuity of becoming which is non-existent in the three times?
And Padmakara. Spanning the three times, therefore there is no existential stream. But how can that which does not span the three times be an existential stream?
The three times refer to the past, the present, and the future. Nāgārjuna has systematically proven that this chain of existences, the bhava-samtana, cannot logically exist in the past because the past is ceased, complete, and gone.
All right.
It cannot exist in the future because the future is unoriginated and lacks any present reality.
And it cannot exist in a frozen, isolated present moment because a present without a past leading into it or a future leading out of it has no duration.
It's a dimensionless mathematical point where no action or transition can possibly occur.
So if time itself cannot logically sustain the weight of inherently existing causes and effects, then the entire wheel of life samsara itself is not an absolute reality. The wheel falls off the axle.
We have executed steps 1 and 2 of the Madhyamaka general reasoning, and we found that the microscopic junction of causality is logically incoherent, which means the macroscopic systems built upon it are equally incoherent.
Which brings us to a critical juncture. We have torn the house down. We were standing in the rubble of absolute causality. Are we just floating in a void of nihilism and meaninglessness?
No, and this is where we transition into section 4. Steps 3, 4, 5, and 6 of our diagnostic framework. Emptiness, interdependence, and illusion.
Because since the absolute bridge crumbled, we have to ask what is actually holding the pieces of our reality together.
This is the rebuild. This is where Nāgārjuna saves causality by radically redefining it. We start with step 3, emptiness.
Okay, step 3.
Step 3 is the realization that because every extreme of the tetralemma led to a logical absurdity, the three spheres at the junction of causality, the origination, the relation, and the disappearance are completely empty of inherent existence.
In Sanskrit, they are empty of svabhava.
Yes. There is no real absolute opposition between them, and there is no absolute relation between them because there are no solid absolute things to oppose or relate in the first place.
They aren't solid blocks of reality colliding in the dark. And that realization forces us directly into step 4, dependent co-origination. Once we realize these spheres don't stand alone as independent entities, we see that they are entirely inseparable.
They are dependently co-originated, interdependent, and co-evolving. Consider spatial concepts. A cause is only a cause because it produces an effect.
Right.
An effect is only an effect because it resulted from a cause. They mutually define each other, entirely dependent on context.
Yeah.
Think of the concepts of up and down or left and right.
You cannot physically isolate up, put it in a jar, and study its inherent upness.
Exactly. Up only exists in relation to down. It is a mutually dependent framework. In the exact same way, the junction of causality is merely co-imputed by the mind.
It's a set of conventional designations that our minds project onto a fluid, centerless web of reality to help us navigate.
Which naturally sets the stage for step 5, which might be the most profoundly beautiful philosophical harmony in this entire system.
The union of the two truths.
It is the absolute pinnacle of the Madhyamaka framework. It bridges the gap between the ultimate and the conventional. The realization is, emptiness is not a dark nihilistic void where nothing matters. Emptiness is the fundamental prerequisite for causality to function at all.
This is where the cognitive shift really happens, because, how can things be ultimately empty of essence yet still conventionally cause things to happen? How does emptiness allow for movement?
Think about it. If things had absolute inherent essence, they would be frozen.
Right.
Think of a physical seed. If a seed had absolute inherent permanent seedness, if its essence was locked in and immutable, it could never ever change.
It could never react to soil or absorb water.
And it could certainly never destroy itself to become a sprout. The universe would be a frozen sculpture of isolated objects. The fact that the seed is empty of a fixed essence is the very mechanism that allows it to interact, to decay, and to transform.
So things can only conventionally cause other things because they are ultimately empty.
Yes. Emptiness is what gives the universe flexibility. It's the room to breathe.
The causal spheres are relatively conventionally useful tools, but they are never absolute. And because they are merely dependently co-originated and empty, we arrive at step 6, illusions.
The texts are very specific in their metaphors here. They describe these phenomena as reflections in a mirror, mirages, dreams, or echoes. They are functionally there, yet not there.
The mirror analogy from our sources is so brilliant for understanding this dynamic. If I stand in front of a mirror, my reflection is conventionally there. I can see it.
You can use it.
Yeah, I can use it to fix my hair or see what shirt I'm wearing.
Yeah.
It has a functional, conventional reality. But if I reach out and try to peel that reflection off the glass to hold it in my hand as an independent, inherently existing object, my hand just hits flat glass.
The reflection has no absolute reality of its own. It is entirely dependent on the light, the mirror, and you standing there.
And that is precisely how we must view the junction of cause and effect, and by extension, the entire karmic cycle. It's a conceptual overlay our minds project onto a fluid reality.
It is.
So, if the massive chain of existence we've been discussing is just a reflection in a mirror, it's like we are obsessively tracing the lineage of a shadow.
Wow. Yeah.
We can measure the shadow, we can predict exactly where the shadow will fall at noon based on the sun, we can even develop a phobia of the shadow, but we can never peel it off the ground and hold it.
Tracing the lineage of a shadow. That insight is the core of the psychological relief this philosophy offers. Suffering arises when we believe the shadow has absolute weight and mass, and we try to fight it or cling to it as if it does.
Right.
When we realize it is an empty projection, the desperate clinging ceases.
Which brings us to the most crucial part of this exploration, really.
Yeah.
applying it to our lives. Section 5, which covers step 7, 9, 10, and 11, the middle way and practical liberation.
Yes, we have to take this incredibly high-level diagnostic logic and ground it in how we actually exist in the world.
So we begin with step 7, the generalized tetralemma.
We apply the generalized tetralemma to affirm that the three spheres at the junction of causality, and indeed all phenomena, are not this, they are not non-this, they are not both, and they are not neither.
Their true nature is entirely beyond conditioned, dualistic, conceptual proliferation.
Exactly. They exist beyond all of our neat little models, our triads, and our dyads. Whenever the human mind tries to pin ultimate reality down and say, it is exactly this, reality just slips through our fingers because reality is fundamentally not this.
But if we can't pin it down, if every absolute model fails, how do we cognitively orient ourselves?
That is step 9, the middle way.
A middle way.
The best attitude toward reality is the middle way, which is defined by being free from all extremes.
Yeah.
It's free from objectivism and realism, the delusion that things are solid, absolute, and inherently existing.
Right.
But crucially, it's also free from subjectivism and nihilism, the delusion that nothing matters, nothing exists, and actions have no consequences.
It's free from rigid dualism and free from monism or radical oneness, the idea that everything merges into a giant, undifferentiated blob.
Exactly. The middle way recognizes that there is nothing to add or subtract to reality in absolute terms. You don't need to force reality to fit your models. You simply observe how the models dependently arise.
But practically speaking, how does a listener, someone who has followed this logic all the way down the rabbit hole, apply this when they log into a high-stakes Zoom meeting tomorrow morning?
Right, the real world.
Or when they face a sudden, devastating personal crisis? How do we utilize step 10, acting without acting?
Step 10 is the practical, lived core of this entire philosophy. We conclude that we can and we must use these causal triads conventionally and relatively. They are incredibly useful tools for navigating human life.
You still need to pay your rent.
Yes. You still need to eat to nourish your physical aggregates. You still engage in the cause and effects of your career. But, and this is the liberating mechanism, you use them without reification. You use them without attachment, without demanding absolute unyielding control over the outcomes.
You engage with life systems knowing their true, empty nature. Let's simulate that psychologically. Imagine you experience a massive failure in your career. You lose your job, or a major project collapses.
Yeah.
The dualistic reifying mind immediately solidifies that event. It says, I am a failure. This event has inherently ruined my absolute trajectory. You treat the failure as a solid block of reality that has crushed you.
But if you apply step 10, you realize the failure is just a dependently arisen event. It is a reflection in the mirror changing shape based on shifting conditions, the economy, your boss's mood, 1,000 microscopic variables you don't control.
You don't treat it as a permanent, absolute stain on your inherent identity.
You stop conceptually indulging in craving for absolute success or aversion to absolute failure because you realize neither of those outcomes possesses an inherent absolute essence. You are acting without acting.
You engage fully, passionately, and compassionately in the flow of life, but with a profoundly light touch.
You are playing the game, but you know it is a game. You are not fundamentally crushed when the rules shift because you know the rules themselves are merely conventional designations. You use the tools of reality while fully knowing their true nature.
And that removes the grinding psychological weight of feeling entirely, absolutely responsible for controlling every microscopic ripple in the universe. It is profoundly liberating.
And that liberation leads us to the final step of the Madhyamaka General Reasoning, step 11, primordial equality. This is the ultimate experiential peak, when you are finally released from the tyrannical hold of fixed concepts. When you stop desperately trying to slice the flowing river into absolute boxes, what remains? You might as well perceive everything, the individual, the cosmos, the junctions, the causes, and the effects, as primordially equal, pure, perfect, complete, divine, and one.
But we must be careful with the word one, right? Not a homogeneous blob where everything loses its distinction.
Exactly. One in a strictly non-dual sense, meaning not many, not one, not both, and not neither. It points to an experience beyond the reach of conceptual limitation. We simply abide in reality exactly as it is.
In Sanskrit, this is tathata, or suchness.
Yes, it is the vibrant, centerless, limitless display of interdependent phenomena, shining without any inherent substance to anchor them.
Which brings us to the outro of our deep dive. We have covered a monumental amount of philosophical ground today. Let's synthesize what this all means for our grand models of the universe.
Through an exhaustive forensic analysis of Chapter 21, Nāgārjuna entirely refutes the absolute reality of the junction between cause and effect. He proves that the coming and the going, the origination and the disappearance, cannot be inherently explained or established by any logical metric.
And because this microscopic causal junction collapses under logical scrutiny, the massive superstructures built on top of it collapse as absolute truths. The theory of a chain of successive moments of consciousness, the karmic cycle of rebirths,
Also gone.
the 12 links of dependent origination, even the profound crossing from the suffering of samsara to the liberation of nirvana, none of these can be defended as absolute inherent realities.
But the crucial takeaway is the value of models. Nāgārjuna is not a nihilist. He is not saying these systems are useless. There is no absolute continuity, but there are also no complete discontinuity.
Right.
These Buddhist frameworks, much like our modern scientific frameworks of physics or biology, are incredibly useful relative models. They are maps that help us navigate the conventional world. The map of dependent origination helps us understand psychological suffering and chart a path out of it.
But the map is not the territory. The X-ray is not the bone.
Precisely. They are relatively useful models, but they are not logically coherent enough to represent reality as it is in its ultimate, ungraspable suchness.
We started this deep dive talking about a broken arm and a clean, precise X-ray. We wanted to point at the screen and say, there's the cause and there is the effect. But we've learned that the diagnostic machine itself, our dualistic conceptual mind, is what creates the jagged lines and boundaries in the first place.
It creates the illusion.
The waters of reality are deeply, profoundly fluid, and trying to freeze them into absolute moments only creates the paradoxes that cause us suffering.
Realizing the fluidity of those waters is the true medicine.
As we wrap up, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, provocative thought to ponder on your own. It builds on everything we've explored today about co-imputation, but it turns the lens directly inward.
Okay.
If the microscopic gap between a cause and an effect is an illusion created by the mind's desperate need to categorize, and if the goer and the going are just empty designations, merely co-imputed by the mind like up and down, then what is the true nature of the consciousness that is currently listening to this analysis?
Oh, it's good.
If you are the one imputing the boundaries of reality, who is imputing you, are you an absolute, inherently existing observer standing outside the river, or are you too just a beautiful, empty reflection in the infinite mirror of dependent origination?
A phenomenal question to sit with as the concepts settle.
Thank you so much for joining us on this rigorous, profound, deep dive into the source material. It has been a cognitive marathon, but navigating the murky waters of reality is always better alongside a peer. Until next time, keep questioning the boundaries.
Thank you for your time and attention. Farewell.